This is Elizabeth Warren, Director of Communications for People Demanding Action. I realize I had myself on mute, so you missed my first part of the introduction. I apologize for that, folks. I am just new to coming back to the calls. This is only my second one after a brief hiatus, so I do apologize. We are going to be welcoming tonight Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizen, as well as Zahara Heckscher from Atlanta, who will be telling us what she has been working on down there, the result of the talks and some of the actions that are being planned as follow-up. Deborah Dion from Citizens Trade Campaign in Florida will not be able to join us. Filling in for her will be Adam Weissman from Trade Justice. And following Adam, we'll hear from Mackenzie McDonald-Wilkins from Flush the TPP about a number of actions being planned through the month of November. Andrea, could we move to the next slide? All right. Just a little bit about the call. Most of you, I think, are familiar with the way the meeting room works. If you're looking at the screen, you can see on the left-hand side that there is a chat that is very active. If you'd like to share something, ask a question, post a link or something related to the call, or ask a question of one of the speakers, you can type it into the lower left-hand corner of the screen and then click the little box that says send. We have a number of folks moderating the chat room who will answer questions for you and try and get them answered. Now I'd like to introduce our host team to you. First is my boss and leader, fearless leader, Andrea Miller, Executive Director of People Demanding Action. Andrea is also a technical expert, programmer by trade and training, who moderates all of the technical stuff behind the scenes for People Demanding Action and PD Action, as well as for this team. She can be reached at peopledemandingaction.org. You can also, if you want to download the PowerPoint, go to the link on that screen. And there's also, if you notice at the very bottom, a share button. So if you'd like to share in the meeting room, you can click on the share button. Tom Hocking is our technical advisor. He is a Move On regional organizer in the state of Pennsylvania. He handles pre- and post-call technical questions and also posts the PowerPoints and other information on the Global TPP Team Facebook page, which you will see a link at the bottom for that page. Liz Amson is a Move On organizer in Los Angeles. She also helps with the call planning and note and resource vetting. So she provides a lot of information and background to the team. Jan Swartzengruber is part of our coordinating team, and apologize to Jan for a little typo in her name. It's actually Swartzengruber with the D. She handles campaign updates, call notes, and she is a Move On regional organizer in the state of Kansas, where she's been fighting the good fight against a very, very right-wing governor. So thanks for your hard work, Jan. We do appreciate everything you do. Mara Cohen is one of our chat hosts, so Mara will welcome you and share notes in the chat if you have a question for her. She also is a leader in the state of Illinois for PDA's mass criminalization team and global climate convergence. Lisa Oldendorf is also one of our chat hosts, and she is a Move On regional organizer in the state of New York and has been instrumental in a lot of the New York actions. Linda Brewster is also a member of our call planning team. She is a Move On regional organizer in the state of Washington and in the Pacific Northwest. Celeste Drake is one of our partners at the AFL-CIO. She's not with us tonight, but she's been instrumental in putting together a lot of our calls, has been fighting tirelessly for fair wages and worker regulations all over the world. In fact, I think she's traveling right now. So we thank Celeste for giving us frequent legislative updates and telling us what's happening and continuing the good fight. Now I'd like to just do a sound check and see if Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizen with Global Trade Watch, is with us now. Lori, are you with us, and is your sound?
I am. Can you hear me?
All right. I can hear you, and I am more than thrilled to turn the mic over to you, Lori, for whatever you want to share with us. And when you are ready to take questions, just let me know and let us know how many questions you'll have time to answer tonight. So
terrific.
Thank Lori Wallach. And Lori, I'm going to give you the floor now.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to our hosts. And it's an honor to be on with all of these fearless anti-fast track and anti-TPP fighters. I am hopefully going to provide a little bit of overview information that can be useful for all of us as we now shift into the next part of the campaign to save ourselves from TPP. It's, gruesome that they made a deal. They made a deal because basically they realized that they didn't make a deal now. The thing was really starting to unravel. And I think it's worth all of us thinking about the fact that along with our counterparts in the other TPP countries, we stopped this deal that was supposed to be done in 2011. It started in 2008, from all these years from being done. The deal that they did, unfortunately, is largely as bad as they had in mind. There are a few places where the pushback actually probably made it less bad, but it still sucks rocks. And so our next task is going to be the same mission that our counterparts in some of the other TPP countries will be undertaking, is to make sure that it doesn't get approved domestically. The TPP can only go into effect if, in fact, it is approved by the U.S. Congress. So I think probably on one of these calls 2 or 3 years ago, I said the only way to make sure we stop TPP is to stop fast track. And that certainly was the case at that point. The thing that happened that's different than then is the fast track fight in this country, which we came so close to winning, is conducted basically as like a proxy battle over the TPP. It was about fast track enabling the TPP. So we have a lot more activists around the country informed about TPP and its threats. A lot more organizations understand how it undermines their goals. A lot of activist members of organizations are hip. But we still need to do a lot more work with the general public if we're going to tank TPP. The thing is, the way the fast track fight was conducted, we actually have a chance to do so, to tank TPP, and in part because the way the last-minute deal was hatched with a lot of crazy stuff in it and out of it. So I'm going to overview a little bit about really sort of 3 things we know. What we know about what's in the deal, number 1. What we can expect in sort of our mission going forward. And then number 3, the messaging. There's a little bit of research, messaging research. There's a new poll that had some questions in about TPP. We know some things about how to communicate. So as far as what we know, despite like amazing stuff, Sahara is going to tell us some of the amazing stuff that happened in Atlanta. There was great stuff going on in all the countries. There has been great stuff going on every round of TPP, in between, before, after, in Congress's parliaments, fighting it. Despite all of that, they hatched a deal, and they basically made a lot of compromises along the way. They're still cleaning up pieces of it because there are tidbits that aren't done. What they did, though, is they announced a deal, and they made deals on the big stuff. And a lot of the way they did that is they did language. They agreed to language, say, on access to biologic medicines that can mean different things to different people. The way all of us should interpret it is it's a lower amount of monopoly power for the pharmaceutical companies, but the U.S., of course, is going to try and make it seem like it's different than that because the language is fishy, and that's how ambiguous language is how they made a deal. Also, a variety of things just got thrown overboard in the name of getting a deal, any deal. So there is a deal. They are doing what's called a legal scrub. A legal scrub is ostensibly just supposed to be making sure that all the language is parallel, that there are no discrepancies in different texts, etc. I think in reality they're probably finishing some things because I think there's some things that weren't done. When the legal scrub is done, and they had already started it before the thing was finished, so who knows when they'll actually have an agreement, the next thing that's going to happen, one of 2 things can happen. Either the United States Trade Representative will give notice to Congress as required under the Fast Track statute, 90 days notice, starts the Fast Track clock. They are off the clock for having a vote this year, even if they just do the 90 days. If the Fast Track statute is followed according to past tradition, which is more than just 90 days, it takes almost 4 months to get through all the pieces. And that means if they gave notice now, we'd be having a vote sometime in the spring. They ostensibly could cut corners and just get down to 90 days, but even if they did that, they're already, into January for a vote. So they will give notice under Fast Track statute, as we all know. They get to hold on to the damn text for 30 days before they make it public after they've given formal notice. Congress can see it ostensibly. We heard they were going to give notice this week. They may still give notice this week. The thing is, they don't have a damn text. So I don't know if anyone saw the most bizarre turn of events, but Senator Hatch, the man who loves fast track and wants to support TPP, basically sent like a cannonball over the deck of the USTR office by saying, do not give us notice unless you have a full text, finished, complete, and scrubbed to give us. So we may actually see notice pushed back if they pay attention to him. There is some chance they could release the scrub text before they're required to, i.e. they could try and get credit for being more transparent by releasing the scrub text the day that they give notice to Congress, not waiting the 30 days that they can. But whenever it comes out, we will then see the final of the final. Folks saw that WikiLeaks already on Friday leaked, Friday, leaked the intellectual property chapter, the final of that. So we've seen EFF talk about the threats to access to information and to the Internet. We've seen the Access to Medicine groups talking about the access to medicine threats. Zahara will speak more to that. But we right now know a lot of things. But just before we shift to what we know, the thing that is the case is as soon as the actual final text comes out, there are a variety of activists, or experts, analysts, professors, etc., who sort of divvied up chapters, and this is going on in a variety of different to try and do more detailed analyses of the chapters to catch things that are not the things we already know that are bad, but undoubtedly there are things in there that are problematic that we don't know about because of the secrecy. So in the interim, there are a lot of things we can and we should say. And one of the things we have to make sure is that the proponents of TPP aren't able to define what's in it. The White House is using the secrecy to be able to say a bunch of horse shit. Like they're running around saying the investor state stuff is fixed. And that is just a crock. We have a very good sense of what is and isn't different there. And there's some things that certainly are better than past ISDS agreements. There's some things that are worse. For instance, for the first time ever, financial service regulations are exposed to the full set of ISDS claims, not just the discrimination claim. Catastrophic problem for financial stability. So in the end, and we only know that because someone has shown us that provision who shouldn't have. So in the end, we're going to see what really is going on. But USTR is using this time to run around, and they're getting news stories. They fixed this. They got a great deal on that. Labor rights are great. Like the labor rights thing they're getting credit on is that there are benefits that Vietnam and Malaysia could lose if they don't implement the labor chapter. But what they don't mention is that Vietnam and Malaysia and other countries would have 5 years to implement the labor chapter. There is no other part of the agreement that you get a 5-year, don't have to follow the rules, do whatever the hell you want, you still get the benefits of the agreement. Just labor rights get treated that way. So not only is it not stronger, we're officially giving you 5 years to break all the rules and get all the benefits. So there's lots of, we know about a couple of these from different surreptitious means. We don't know the half of it. So until we get the text, I'm going to explain a little bit of what we can all say. We need to get the word out about what we can say. The talking points I sent out last week, I know have gone pretty far and wide. So if you don't have them, go to our website, tradewatch.org. They're there. That is the way you can talk about what we know. Despite the secrecy, we know blah, blah, and here's the reason why. And it gives us the grounding we need for members of Congress, for the press, when they say, well, how can you know it's secret? For each one of the things we know, there's an explanation of why we know it. And we know enough to know it's really bad. And when the text comes out, we're going to know even more details. Hopefully there'll be some positive surprises. But given what we know about it, there is nothing to be hopeful about that this is an agreement that is not, as it's always been feared, NAFTA on steroids. So we have an investor state dispute resolution. Whatever tweaky changes they made to that, the bottom line remains, number one, the incentives, the investor incentive to offshore jobs, the fact you can get compensated for taking the normal risk of relocating to a developing country for low wages, the thing that the Cato Institute calls a subsidy on offshoring, that language is in there. Why do we know that? Because that language has been in there for the last 3 leaks of the investor state, of the investment chapter, and it hasn't been in brackets. It was decided years ago. So we know that pro-offshoring incentive language that will cost American jobs is there. We know that the investor state system is there. No matter how tweaked, it is still a system where foreign companies alone will have a right to skirt the U.S. court system and U.S. laws and demand compensation in extrajudicial tribunals. Even if they have tried to tweak those tribunals, it is still the case. What the hell is wrong with our court system? Point 3, we know there are 9,000 additional corporations that would be thus empowered to have investor state rights that currently have no such right. Many of those are Japanese firms, but there are from other countries as well. 9,000. That is as many companies that currently have investor state rights to attack U.S. law with every single one of our current free trade agreements combined. TAFTA, NAFTA, all the FTAs does not add up quite to 9,000. In TPP, 9,000 new companies can go in investor state. We know that already. We don't need to see the chapter. We know this. We know that chapter bans the use of capital controls, very important financial regulatory instrument. We know that because that was decided years ago. Number 2 thing we know there's a ban on Buy America and Buy Local. Why do we know that? Because the Trade Representative's Office told us. They call it non-discrimination in government procurement. It boils down to any company in any of those TPP countries, including the Chinese state-owned enterprise firms all over Vietnam, would have equal rights to bid on U.S. government contracts. So instead of our tax dollars being reinvested to create jobs at home and spur innovation, we're going to have those jobs and that money offshored to any company in any TPP country on an equal basis. We know that. We know the language is in there that will lead to challenges of sweat-free and prevailing wage and other conditions on procurement. We know that because the Trade Representative's Office says it's the same language that's in the Korea Agreement, and that is that language. We also know that Canada got new rights to get around Buy America. We don't know all the details, but they're crowing about it in their media. We know that there are no currency provisions against currency cheating. So we know whatever tariff cuts happen that ostensibly, and you're going to get this argument, especially if your target is from a state that has agriculture exports, congresspersons like to say, well, all these things you're mentioning are horrible, but we're going to sell more pork. Boy, we got those tariff cuts in Japan. It's a big market. We're going to have pork, we're going to have chicken, we're going to have beef. And the problem is there are no disciplines against currency cheating in TPP, despite repeatedly bipartisan majorities ordering such a thing in Congress. So what's that mean? Let's just say there's a 30% tariff cut on pork. Japan devalues 30% over the course of a year and a half. The tariff cut is gone. The next year they devalue 15 more percent. It's like raising the tariff 15%. Absent currency disciplines, there is no real market access. That is why Ford Motor Company and the other big U.S. car makers have basically at this point urged Congress to oppose TPP because they got tariff cuts. But they know they're going to have the currency scam, and they're not going to sell anything. And these are companies that have supported all these past agreements. We know that the food safety rules that requires to import food that doesn't meet our standards are in there, and we know that because that was already agreed the last time that chapter leaked. And finally, we know that the intellectual property chapter with respect to access to medicine, and this is shameful, rolled back the so-called May 2007 standard, the Access to Medicine Standard for developing countries, that George W. Bush had to agree to because of the Democrats in Congress. Our Democratic President Obama and his USTR have rolled back significant parts of that. But for every member of Congress who said, I wouldn't support anything with the May 2007 deal, on medicine, it is clearly rolled back. Very, very outrageous. So those are things we know without ever seeing the agreement. Once we have the agreement, we will know more. So then what is our mission? Our mission, I would say, is 2 parts. In the short term, our mission is to get the American public's hair on fire about TPP, and we have a lot of work to do. So the most recent polling on TPP shows a lot of people still have no idea what it even stands for. They don't know what those initials are. Activists are now hip. We all have done a great job getting a community of people who are politically aware turned on. What we have not done is say what our brothers and sisters in Germany have done around TAFTA, the U.S.-EU agreement. The folks know this weekend they had 250,000, 250,000 people protesting in Berlin. Their protest against TTIP, against TAFTA, the march was enormous that they ran out of space for the back of the march to actually keep going forward about 8 blocks away from the area where they were doing the rally because they filled up the area. They had 100,000 more people than they'd hoped to have, and they were hoping to have 150,000. That is a level of public awareness where it's not only activists, but that's actually just folks who care about inequality, who care about human rights, who care about food, the environment, whatever is the issue that motivates them, they realize this agreement is bad for them. And they took the time in their private lives, not as regular activists, but as people who actually were moved by this threat. People who aren't normally on the streets, and they got a huge turnout. That is still our mission. We have to get the American public much more aware. And the thing we have going for us is this election cycle where we have at least 10 of the candidates pounding on TPP, some of them highly opportunistically, not to be trusted, but you know something? For instance, Clinton's, I would say, a highly unreliable new position, but God bless her for it. If she were the president, it would take a lot of doing to keep her to that, but you know something? We should give her kudos because it's put it all over the news. The whole public is having to listen to what is TPP and why is she against it, and what's this currency thing, and what is the job story. Incredibly helpful. Super helpful that Bernie Sanders made that an issue she had to respond to. Super helpful in a perverse way that a bunch of the Republican candidates are screaming about what a badly negotiated deal TPP is. And they've got cover because they've got the auto industry and other people who are against it. The word TPP needs to get out. It needs to have a negative view attached to it. And we have a bunch of work to do to just broadly get the American public more educated and upset. We will need to do that if we want to have a different outcome than fast track. We need to make it a big public fight. And then we're eventually going to have a vote. Now, here's how the vote timing works. Once notice is given, there's this 90-day period, plus there should be some other periods. Basically, under any circumstances, we're not having a vote until the beginning of 2016. Okay. The question is this going to play out like the Korea Agreement, where they realize they don't have the votes and it gets pushed back? It'd be very dangerous, say, if it were to get pushed back into the lame duck session, where the unelected, the retired, and the fired get to vote. We need to basically have the TPP become so unpopular, the other countries, it doesn't go into effect unless both the U.S. and Japan, plus some other countries, vote for it. So if we don't actually have it voted on in Congress, we actually also help save our brothers and sisters in the other countries from having it go into effect. And there are some big knockdown, drag-out fights in other countries about TPP as well. The math of the vote for this, basically, now honing way in on the potential vote and what we need to do while we're doing the macro work of making a big public fight about this, we also need to get to our members of Congress now. Because the White House is using the secrecy to run around and try and convince members of Congress that they fixed things that members of Congress said they had problems with. A lot of members of Congress have said they have problems with specific things.
So what? You know a lot of what's in the TPP. Yeah.
So what we've got. Do other people hear someone else speaking?
I have my computer and stuff up there.
Yes, Lori, I do, and I'm trying to mute everyone. Anyone who called in using a speaker code, please mute your phones now if you have not done so. I'm having to go through and mute people, and it's pretty awkward when it's your turn to speak. So please mute yourself. Thanks, folks. Go ahead, Lori. Apologies. Lori, can you hear me?
Can you hear me? And I'm back.
Yeah, okay. I think I muted all the speakers along with you, so I apologize. All right.
Okay. So what I was saying is that the round to all of the 28 Democrats who voted for Fast Track, trying to get them committed to vote for TPP. We need to get there first, and we need to get the ones, and there are about half of them that we could get back. We need to get those guys to hold their powder dry. Do not take a position. And the strongest argument for that is, who knows what's really in there? You guys know what it was like and what the hell you're still getting from voting for Fast Track. You're going to just take the administration's word. We want you to look at that agreement. We want to look at that agreement. We want to sit and talk to you about that agreement. Don't you take a position based on their representation. Because the White House is just running around lying, blowing smoke up people's asses, trying to get them to support it. So for the 28 yeses, it's really important, as mad as you might be about with those people still, unless it's one of the folks who's going to get primaried out and they're out of here, we need to go basically get to them, make sure they keep their powder dry. There are another about 25 members who, as everyone will recall in the House, Democrats, were enormously difficult to get to do the right thing and fast track. Some folks on the phone are the people who wrestled, say, Earl Perlmutter to the floor. Some people on the phone are the people who, in the end, got, I'm trying to think of who the hardest suspects were, because there were so many. A bunch of people did a lot of great work and got people who are very tough customers to do the right thing. If you had a member who was a piece of work on fast track, that member is probably on the target list. There is a list of about 55 House members who we either know are going to be trouble, who are trouble, who could be trouble, who often think they're trouble, so they therefore have to be treated as trouble. And those guys we're going to need to keep on constantly. The things that we'll be able to show to them are many of the things they signed letters demanding: that currency is in, that the ban and Buy America is out, that investor state is out, that there is no requirement, for instance, in the agreement that we cannot do anything for human rights conditions on countries like Brunei. Those kinds of clear lines of things we can go to them with and say, hey, you're on these letters saying if it's this, you won't support it. Guess what? The thing you said you had to have is not in there, or the thing you said you wouldn't live with is in there. We got a lot of those folks on letters, and I'm not going into detail on the labor and environment because we really aren't sure all of what is in those chapters in detail, but we suspect a bunch of the things on the environment that those pro-fast-track Democrats said they have to have aren't in there. And you'll notice, just so it's clear, that NRDC, the big pro-NAFTA environmental group, Sierra Club, basically all but the two super conservative conservation-only groups, World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy, all the other environmental groups are either silent or against TPP. And World Wildlife and Nature Conservancy have said, oh, they're good conservation things, and they were glad, though, because they're going to do something on shark finning. And then they ignore investor state. So we will have more detail for what it is with those House members who we all hounded to the ground, got in all those letters since and before Fast Track to show why they have to be against. It would have just been a House fight, but the perverse thing that's happened is there were enough things done. The White House did enough things. They're going to lose even their 28 fast-track votes to piss off some Republicans. And that includes, for instance, and we don't know how good it is, it's all word of mouth, but there may be a real carve-out for tobacco from investor state. If that's really in there, then they're going to lose some Republicans on the Senate side. And we may actually have a Senate side fight. It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. If, in fact, some of these big Senate fast-track champions are as mad as they sound right now, then we could see this agreement really get jammed. I think our focus will stay in the House, and I think we'll know who the targets are. There's also going to be a Republican House strategy, and we're going to have to figure out how that is messaged properly, which is my last point. Of the polling questions that have gone out, the things that we know that we can talk about are job offshoring, perennial hot issue, that the TPP will throw American workers into direct competition with workers in Vietnam who make 60 cents an hour. That is a line that is very compelling. Third top line reaction across the board, Democrats, Republicans. TPP includes notorious human rights violators such as Brunei and Malaysia and Vietnam. Fourth issue, the TPP is going to increase medicine prices by giving big pharma monopolies that will stop generic competition. And fifth issue, the TPP will require us to import food and products that are unsafe and threaten our families' health. Those are the top issues for the general public. Obviously, currency, investor state, financial regulation, internet issues are all important issues for policymakers, for activists. But those 5 issues are the ones that in the general public polled the most strongly. And I'm going to stop there.
Thanks so much, Lori. That gives us a lot to work with. Now I'd like to invite everyone to ask Lori questions, and she's going to let us know, if you could, Lori, let us know when it's time for the last one, or just before the last one. Press *6 on your telephone, and we will call on as many folks as we can. Okay, we have a hand up now. Dr. Laura Chamberlain in Chicago. Go ahead. What's your question for Lori?
Hello?
Hello, yes. What's your question for Lori?
Lori, so could you go over again the timing of this? So we for sure get 90 days, maybe from today, but maybe or maybe from when they released it, or just go over the timing again before so we know for sure when they might vote on it.
Okay. First of all, let me send folks also to our website. I have a memo up on our website on the timing, the statutory timing. So under Fast Track, there is supposed to be notice to Congress before the agreement can be signed of 90 days. 30 days into that, the public's guaranteed access to the text. So 90 days notice of intent to sign and enter the agreement. Ostensibly, they could have a vote the next day. And that would be the beginning of January, in the middle of, basically January 11th, if they did it tomorrow. However, 12th. However, there are other time periods in Fast Track. There's supposed to be a 30-day period when they put down the implementing legislation before there's a vote. But the way the bill's written, it theoretically could be concurrent with the 90 days. There is supposed to be an International Trade Commission study. It cannot take longer than 105 days after the notice. But it doesn't have to take the 105 days, and maybe they've started cooking the numbers already because the ITC studies have been a little fishy in the past. There are a variety of other notices for committees to report, etc., that ostensibly, if you add it up, the whole Fast Track process from when the 90-day notice is given should take about 4 months. But really, it could be as fast as 90 days. So we have to be ready for the potential sort of cheating version of just 90 days plus 1 day for a vote. That is not likely to be how it plays out, mind you. But it could. If the Republican congressional leadership is willing to go along with that, it could go that fast. And when they give the notice was probably going to be this week until Senator Hatch, Ways and Finance Committee Chairman, sent a nasty gram last week to USTR saying, do not give notice until you have a text to give us. We suspect what USTR intended to do is give notice of intent to enter and not actually have a text to give Congress until they had the text to make public. And that meant they would basically be scrubbing the text while the notice was tolling. And happily, enough of industry is worried about what exactly they did at the end to get the deal that they convinced Hatch to send that letter saying don't do it until you have a text to release. Now, they could play chicken and give the notice anyway. Hard to know what they're going to do because they've managed to piss off a variety of people who are normally their friends. So I would say we should be ready that notice could happen this week. They could still do that. They do not have a text to release. So if they do that, they're going to piss off some more people, and in the short term, that could be helpful for us.
Okay, thanks, Lori. All right, now we've got someone at 908-349-1080. Go ahead and ask your question.
Ms. Wallach, thank you for being on. Hugh Campbell from Union, New Jersey. You mentioned early in your presentation about China's subsidiaries in Vietnam. Since China's not part of TPP, but they have subsidiaries in a TPP country, will they be able to use the investor-state dispute settlement by way of their Vietnam subsidiaries, but insulate themselves from it being used against them by not being part of TPP?
Yep, so that's a really interesting question. So basically, Chinese firms operating in Vietnam or Malaysia, where they're, say, even a state-owned enterprise firm, a Chinese government-run firm in one of those other TPP countries, if it's actually established in the other country and is an investment, so the Vietnamese branch of a Chinese firm has an investment in the U.S., yes, they can use investor state. However, no, the U.S. company that's, say, in the same business could not then sue the Chinese government through investor state using TPP. The U.S. firm could sue the Vietnamese government but for something they did in Vietnam, but they couldn't sue the Chinese government, but the Chinese firm in Vietnam can sue the U.S. government.
Thanks, Lori. Stan Sorsher has a hand up. Stan, go ahead.
Hi. One of the talking points we hear from the USTR is that they've added language about investor-state dispute settlement that protects regulation in the public good. And I forget, I think I saw a paragraph or something. But if that's the case, why would they need to carve out tobacco? And is there anything that does protect or carve out regulation in the public good?
Right. So that's a question. There are two ways to answer that. First of all, we haven't seen the text. We know what the language is, but I'm pretty sure I know what the language is. And so there's an overarching problem, which is the investor-state system structurally has such a deep conflict in it that whatever language you put into it to try and fix the substantive law can basically be ignored because you have private sector panelists. So, in the U.S. court system, in most countries' court systems, there's some system of precedent and there's some system of appeal. So if you have a rogue panel of judges or a judge who just makes shit up, the thing gets appealed and it gets brought in within the scope of the precedent. The problem with investor state is you have this ad hoc 3-person tribunal, and even if, and this is one of the things I think they may have done, they have some new conflict of interest rules about, imagine this, you can't be on the board of the company that's suing the government that you're pretending to be a judge for. That's not a rule yet. There's a real case like that in an investor state having to do with a bank in Argentina. So if they have some conflict of interest rules, it does not matter because there is no outside appeal and there is no precedent. So here's the deal. Stan, you, me, and, Andrea are the tribunalists. And we get the TPP text. And let's just say the TPP text, which I don't think it does, says no policy that serves the public good can be challenged. And what's more, anything that helps the climate is cut out. And what's more, blah, blah, blah. And we, as a tribunal who cannot be appealed on the merits, and of whom there is no jurisprudence, no accountability on precedent, we just look at that and we go, well, that was cute of them to write that, so what are they going to do, send in an army? Because what everyone should know, from the NAFTA investment chapter to the CAFTA investment chapter, a bunch of changes were made that 10 years ago. We heard the trade representative of the day say, we fixed that. We put an exception to exclude public interest policies. So there is a whole annex that literally says non-discriminatory public interest measures for the environment, labor, and like a whole list of stuff shall not generally be subject to investors. The first tribunal that looked at that under CAFTA just laughed at it and blew it off. And then there are all kinds of very specific legal standards, which are probably even more to the point. There's allegedly a change in one of the legal standards that's supposed to change the burden of proof, which should, in a way, should be even harder for the panel to blow off than that kind of broad language stand you're talking about public good. That should be harder to fudge. Well, there was a similar thing in CAFTA relative to NAFTA, and the tribunalists literally just wrote an opinion saying, yeah, we don't think the parties to the agreement, i.e. the countries, understood what they meant here, so we're going to interpret it for them. And they interpreted it back to the NAFTA standard. So there is no accountability, even if you do have the new language. It's the first thing because of the structural conflict of no outside appeal, private sector, no precedent. The second thing is, I think the language that's in there is probably the CAFTA language. And the U.S. fought, we know, tooth and nail to stop a real exception. Malaysia and other countries are pushing for a real exception broadly for public interest measures. And as folks who recall, they were, the text is leaked, the investment text leaked a couple times. And we got to see that language from Malaysia and then the U.S. against it. And then we saw that language weakened and the U.S. still against it. And then the last week, the language was gone. And the really shitty exception was left, which if they adopted would have meant nothing. So I am both not optimistic that real language is in there, but even if it was the real language, a tribunal can ignore it. So that is why I said the reforms, I think we need to just shoot down immediately the notion that somehow tweaking some language in there is actually going to change things, or even having conflict of interest rules for the tribunalists, if in fact just one class, foreign corporations invested in the U.S., have a whole set of rights to use even private sector corporate attorneys who have conflict of interest rules as compared to our courts with all of their different protections and rights for third-party observers, openness, etc. So that is the basic answer to that, and that is their talking point. And part of the reason I am convinced they are not that chapter's done to show that chapter to Congress. And I don't think they want Congress to see what really is in there versus the horseshit they're dishing out to try and make it seem they fixed it. And they're getting reporters to cover that they fixed it. And anyone who wants to join me in hollering at reporters, contact me offline. I'll give you the list of people who've written totally bullshit stories about this just on the hearsay of USTR.
I'm going to jump in for a second, Lori, and say that would be a great list. If you share it with us, we'll make sure that folks get it too. as part of our campaign. So Dr. Bill Honigman has a question. Dr. Bill?
Hey, hi. Thanks, Liz. Hello, Lori. Thank you so much. Great update. This is Bill Honigman. I'm the PDA organizer in California and also a practicing ER physician. My question to you is what do you think happened to the kind of political horseshoe that we had? I know Steve Cobble likes to call it that. I call it a reach around, where right and left met around back, and we seem to have lost the folks who were signed on to the Bachmann letter as being against anything that Obama put forward. They certainly don't like him, as the commander-in-chief, let alone the trade negotiator-in-chief. And even my own Congress member from here in Orange County, California, formerly a guy named John Campbell, was strongly opposed to the TPP. Now his replacement, a newbie named Mimi Walters, who is kind of a John Boehner clone, was in favor of it, or at least in favor of fast track. So did we lose some of that, right and left meet around back kind of thing, that was in the Bachmann letter and the DeLauro letter, or are they still there? Do we have to convince those folks that it's still a bad idea? Because they're not going to buy into this, offshoring jobs and protecting workers around the world thing. That's not their thing. They're much more kind of libertarian-minded. What do you think?
Yep. So the answer is, to win in the House, it's a Democratic minority, so the majority is Republicans. The math is not going to be dissimilar from the fast track math. And just, for folks to recap fast track, because I was out of the loop from after the vote, and I know you probably had a lot of debriefs, but, from my take of what more or less happened with fast track is when the Democratic number went over 20, we started hemorrhaging Republicans, because they knew if it was going to be more than 20 Democrats, which to some degree was the Democratic House leadership wanting there be more than 20 Democrats, if there were going to be more than 20 Democrats voting yes, then there was a pretty decent chance that fast track was going to pass. And that's when the Republicans started to fall off. There were a lot more Republican no's in that strange horseshoe of where basically the progressive Democrats and the populist Republicans are closer to each other at the bottom of the horseshoe prongs than they are at the top of the horseshoe where the corporate parts of each party hang out. And I would say it's not an even-handed horseshoe anymore as far as the distribution of corporatists, but it's sort of a lopsided horseshoe. But be that as it may, when we lost on fast track, it's because we had a bunch of those populist Republicans, and they were buyable by Paul Ryan at the point where they realized fast track was likely to pass, and they may as well get something for it after having been against it. It is unclear to me if we'd stayed to our goal of 20 or less Democrats if we would have seen those Republicans peel off, because they would not have been able to peel enough of them to pass fast track. So when we're looking at the TPP math, of course, we have to get a big block of those same Republicans who are against fast track, and then more, because we didn't have enough no votes last time. We need to get more Democrats. We need to get more Republicans. And I think the issues that are the most compelling from the conservative side have to do, number one, with specific business issues. So, for instance, the rule of origin for autos and auto parts. The rule of origin means how much of a particular product has to be made within a TPP country for it to get the duty-free access. So in NAFTA, for autos and auto parts, it was 62.5% had to be U.S., Mexico, or Canada. That meant a whole new auto parts industry with U.S. investors, with Canadian investors, plus a lot of U.S. auto parts manufacturers who would be more expensive than, say, parts in China, suddenly had a market. Because you couldn't sell that car, that Toyota, say, made in Mexico, assembled in Mexico, unless the parts came from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, a certain percent, 62.5% of the part value. And so the thing that's very scary, and we'll know for sure exactly how bad it is we understand the rule of origin for autos went down to 45%. So there are going to be a bunch of Republicans who represent manufacturers of parts who are going to be, for their own sort of commercial reasons, really unhappy about that. They're going to get basically displaced by Chinese imported parts. Japanese cars that are now being made in Texas or being made in Mexico in the assembly plants won't have to be assembled here anymore. They won't need the 62.5% content in the NAFTA zone. They can be assembled in Thailand of parts from China, as long as, say, the engine comes from Japan, and they'll still, be able to meet this lower criteria. So similarly, there are other industries that are unhappy, and some of them are folks who are unhappy, and it's not going to make us happy that they're unhappy, but for instance, all these tobacco-related interests are very unhappy about this putative carve-out, and please God that that's really in there, but they're unhappy about that. There are a bunch of folks who are in different other sectors like shrimp and catfish that are upset about things that they did or didn't get. There are people in the dairy sector, the conservative Republican dairy industry groups have not taken a position yet. They're certainly not happy. I don't know if they're going to oppose, but there might be some members that will. So there are commercial protection issues there. Number two are sovereignty issues, and that gets to investor state. A lot of Republicans hate investor state. A lot of the conservatives are very nervous about UN and World Bank tribunals. From their perspective, it's sovereignty, and perhaps from our perspective, it's more about democracy. But in the end, it's an American value not to have foreign companies skirt our domestic courts, and rather, it doesn't matter if you're a foreign company or a domestic company, you should be treated the same in U.S. law and U.S. courts. Our courts work fine for everyone. Number three issue is human rights. You'll recall the letters that were bipartisan. There was a big letter with Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and other members, Chris Smith from New Jersey, about the human rights issues with Brunei, with Malaysia. The fourth issue is currency. The big currency issue, that a letter that came out a couple weeks ago had, 50 Republicans on it. Those are four issues, with three issues, and fourth is a whole set of commercial issues, where there are a lot of upset Republicans, and then a bunch of them don't like the waiver of Buy America, members of Congress. So we got some very specific things there that we can all be working on, because we're only going to win if Red America and Blue America basically make for enough members of Congress to get a majority.
Thanks, Lori. Do you have time for any more questions, or where are we?
I can do a couple more questions, but I want to make sure, I want to hear Zahara. So why don't we have Zahara talk, and then if people have questions for me during Zahara's Q&A, I want to stick on through Zahara.
Okay, well then we'll just go ahead and we'll jump right to Zahara, and then open it up for questions for the two of you. Okay, Zahara, now I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I'm going to go ahead and clear the question queue, everyone. There are a couple folks left in it. I'm going to ask Zahara to please press *6 on your telephone. And with luck, you should come up, and I will see you there. Okay.
I just unmuted. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, you just unmuted. There you are. All right. Welcome, welcome, Zahara Heckscher. Everyone who hasn't heard of this wonderful lady, she is a breast cancer survivor who managed to get herself arrested in Atlanta, getting national attention for her efforts to basically deal with the whole death clause, and she's going to tell us about that and more. So welcome, Zahara.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be on with all the organizers and activists. Just briefly about my background, I have been following global trade issues for many, many years. In fact, the first date I had with my husband, which was over 12 years ago, was to go see Lori speak about international trade issues at American University. So that's how long I've been following the issues. My background goes back to the anti-apartheid movement, also working on World Bank and human rights advocacy. But I am very new to the TPP advocacy. It comes from my personal experience as a breast cancer patient. If you go to the next slide, I actually was diagnosed 7 years ago this week with breast cancer, and I was diagnosed 3.5 years ago with advanced breast cancer. So I am dependent on medicines to stay alive, and that includes the new medicines such as the biologics, which are medicines made from living tissues, and that includes monoclonal antibodies, and other large molecule medicines, and also what they call small molecule medicines. That just means non-biological medicines, or the more traditional medicines. And I found out that all of these medicines are going to be affected by the TPP. But I come to the issue with a very personal understanding of how important access is as a patient. And I also know what it means when you don't have access. And that's because my own mother had breast cancer about 30 years ago, and that was before the new medicines were available. She lived less than a year after her diagnosis. She died just before I turned 12. And that's the reality of breast cancer without the new treatments, the effective treatments. And it's not just about the patient herself or himself, it's about the children and the family. So that is where my passion comes from. Also the fact that I'm doing really well. You see me here on the stand-up paddle. The medicines are not only keeping me alive, they're keeping me strong. And I want other women with breast cancer and other cancer patients to feel as good as I do. And that is only possible when everyone has access to the right medicines. So how did I get involved with TPP? Well, I found out from my friend Melinda, who works with Lori. She's my jogging partner, and she told me about the part of the TPP that would make biologics more expensive and less affordable. And as I looked into the issue, I said, that's a death sentence clause, and we've started to call it the death sentence clause. And I said to Melinda, what can I do? I'll do whatever it takes, and I'll protest. I'll get arrested. And as you know, that's what ended up happening. I want to talk just in a little bit more about the death sentence clause, and then I can answer more questions about that in the Q&A. But here are a few of the headlines of things that you should know about it. That first of all, this is all in the intellectual property chapter of the TPP, and this section was just leaked on WikiLeaks, I believe on Friday, so recently that I haven't even had a chance to look over it. But we know the basics. We knew the basics even before it was leaked. So essentially what it's going to do is the part that deals with the biologics is going to lock in monopolies for 5 to 8 years. Pharma was hoping for 12, and they got a 5 to 8, which is still a death sentence for people with cancer and the other diseases that are treated with these medicines. So the death sentence clause, unfortunately, is still in there. It prevents generics, or in the case of biologics, they call them biosimilars rather than generics. But the effects are deadly, and this is in particular for the poor countries that are part of the TPP, Mexico, Peru, Vietnam, etc. There's just no way a woman in Mexico, for example, is going to be able to afford some of these medicines. The medicines that I take cost up to $100,000 a year. So these are extremely expensive. The price is not high because of the cost of manufacturing. And that's expensive, but not $100,000 worth of expense. And certainly we know that the big pharma, when they say they need this money for the drug development, that is not true. They've managed to develop the medicines without TPP. They do not need the TPP and these extra monopolies in order to innovate. So the high prices are, first going to affect women in the poor countries. Even in Australia and New Zealand, where the government pays for health care, they've already had trouble paying for certain biological medicines. In New Zealand, they restricted access to one of the most important breast cancer treatments because of the high price. And then, of course, in the United States, it affects us too. It affects uninsured women, and not just women, men, anyone with one of these illnesses, people with high deductibles, and then it affects us all through our taxes. Because when the biosimilars are not available, when the prices are high, we all pay for the various forms, for veterans, for example, for their health care and for health care premiums. So it affects people all over the world. Honestly, it's not going to affect me personally as directly because I'm lucky enough to have good health insurance and I live in D.C. where I have access to clinical trials, but I know that it is a life or death issue for other people suffering from cancer. So I'm motivated as much by a sense of solidarity as by personal interest. It's important to note that the TPP, it's not just affecting these biologics. It also affects the regular medicines, or what we could call the small molecule medicines, in a similar way, and they have all sorts of crazy legalese and different terminologies about some of it has to do with data exclusivity, and there's other technical terms, but the bottom line is reducing access to medicines that are needed to save lives. I'll tell you really, really briefly about what happened in Atlanta. I was invited there to protest. When I got off the plane, I was told that I was going to be the only one being arrested. That was a bit of a shock, but I was happy to do that. And coordinated with the local activists, the American Friends Service Committee, Jobs with Justice, the folks with Public Citizen, and then various other organizations that were there represented. The arrest was only one of a series of many events, and we had a press conference. There were people that came in all the way from Japan to protest, and as you know, if you've seen the video, I basically, you don't know this part. I wore a nice conservative outfit, went into the hotel, slipped upstairs to our secret location, got my special T-shirt on, my IV pole, and then went down to the 7th floor with a microphone hooked up and my talking points, which were to see the secret text, for the U.S. negotiators to represent all of us, not just pharma, for the other countries to stay strong, and of course to drop the death sentence clause. Very quickly I was warned and then arrested. When they arrested me, they forgot to take off the mic, so I had an extra couple of minutes to spread the message. 10 hours later, after going through the jail, which was another crazy story, when I got out, Melinda told me that 40,000 people had already seen the video. Now, we planned this. It was all very strategic. We planned it as to get media coverage and to spread awareness. But never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined that 40,000 people would watch it just in those hours that I was in jail, let alone the media coverage that has come out of it. So I want to, on the next slide, I just want to share some of the lessons from this action. And the first one is, the TPP is going to affect millions of people. And initially I was a little, I would almost say, like, angry at the media for focusing on my individual case instead of looking at how it's going to affect everyone. Also, I was there as an individual working in coordination with the organizations, but there are really important organizations, including the groups I mentioned. Even Doctors Without Borders has taken a strong stance. So why did they focus so much on my individual story, and I realized after a while the TPP is so complex that me standing up as an individual cancer patient allowed people to break down something complicated to individual. This is about individual lives. The TPP may not kill me, but trust me, if it passes, people are going to die because of lack of access to medicines. So being able to tell that story in a more simple way, I think, was powerful. And that was a lesson for me as an organizer, even though, I've been doing this kind of work on other issues for many years. Another quick lesson is just the importance of strategic planning coordination rather than random acts of activism. I do believe in activism and protest, but this was really carefully coordinated with the experts so that what I did as an individual would be in line with Public Citizen, Global Trade Watch, and the other groups that have been doing what I consider to be the much harder work than what I did. The real heroes here are the people like Lori and Melinda who've been working on it, and probably many of you too. You've been working on it for many, many years doing the hardcore organizing. So that was another lesson. Flexibility, we had to change the arrest plan a few times because the negotiators changed their plan. So we had a solid plan, but we definitely had to be flexible. And then another lesson is just the importance of working with a team of people who really get media and social media. I did not, as an individual, have the capacity to spread that story around, but it was the other people who were involved with organizations who were able to do that. And that's really key right now when it's so important for people in the U.S. to learn, where people are just starting to learn what even the TPP stands for. And then final lesson, I think, is it was important to have the visuals, the IV poll and the T-shirt turned my individual action into something that was bigger and more symbolic. And then finally, everyone I talked to, from the cops who arrested me to the women with me in jail, when I explained what I was doing, they said, "Oh, I understand why you're doing that. That makes sense. Medicine's too expensive." So this is a good way to break down the TPP. If the other parts seem really complicated and abstract, access to medicine is something that people can understand. And on the final slide, I just have some suggestions for people who want.
Zahara,
yeah.
Just to let you know, we're about 10 minutes behind schedule. Do you think maybe we could skip through the final slide quickly so we have time for
let's just put the slide up because people can read it for themselves. It's just, I think getting other cancer patients involved is a good idea, and I'll take questions if we have time.
Fantastic. Yeah, why don't we let folks just digest what's on the slide, maybe go back to the slides about the cancer patient while people ask the question, and then they can read. So if you have a question for Zahara, press *6. Before we start, though, I think I need to remember that Adam Weissman did have a question for Lori. So when you finish, Zahara, Adam's going to jump in and ask a question of Lori before we get into his part. So we have B. Sanderson who has a hand up. Go ahead, B. You have the mic, B. Sanderson. B. Sanderson, area code 503. Do you have a question for Zahara? Go ahead, ask your question.
I was just wondering, how can people get more involved into live protests and just activism in general? I'm from Oregon, and I'm just been researching on TPP and stuff like that. I was just wondering, how can people get more involved?
Could I jump in before you answer that and suggest Oregon Fair Trade Campaign would be a good place if you look them up online? And go ahead, Zahara.
Yeah, basically I would just direct you to the people there who are already organizing, not to start a new group or new organization, but to link in with the groups who are already taking leadership and or groups you're already involved with, such as, if you have a faith-based community or a labor organization you're involved with, talking with the leadership. I'm sure you'll find a receptive audience to getting them involved in advocacy. And Public Citizen, I'm sure if you contact them directly, they can also connect you with some of the local leadership in your area that can help you figure out where you can fit in, because there's so many, some of us are better at the protest part, and some people are better at meeting with members of Congress, and some people are better at writing an op-ed, so they can plug you in wherever your strength is.
Okay, thank you.
And can I just send folks to the Citizens Trade Campaign website? It's Citizens Trade, one word, citizenstrade.org. If you click on the map for Oregon, you can get the contact information for Elizabeth Swager at the Oregon Fair Trade Campaign. But for other folks who want to get hooked in, there's a CTC chapter in most of the states around the union. And if there isn't a CTC chapter, there's a contact person to get in touch with local activists. So citizenstrade.org, click on your state in the map, and it'll give you the contacts.
Thanks, Lori. And I just posted for you a couple of times here, too, the link to the Citizens Trade campaign in Oregon. So you should be all set in that. As Lori noted, you can click on any state in the union and find your Citizens Trade organizer there. All right, so let's see where we are. We've got a couple more minutes for questions. Adam Weissman, you had a question for Lori. Go ahead.
Yes, I did. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so my question was, and partly I'm asking this in the hopes that we can put out some messaging to try to get ahead of groups like the Humane Society of the United States and World Animal Protection before they start saying that TPP is the best thing since sliced bread. So wondering, first of all, how substantive are all the wonderful wildlife things that the Obama administration is touting in TPP? Are any of them substantive, or are they fairly meaningless? And secondly, what are some strong pro-wildlife arguments that we can use against TPP?
Very good questions. Unfortunately, Adam, we don't know all the details because that's actually one part of the agreement that hasn't leaked. The one thing we do know is one of the things that have been claimed that they finally have gotten Japan to agree to enforceable disciplines against fishery subsidies almost certainly is not accurate in a meaningful way, which is it seems that maybe they got Japan to agree to disciplines on subsidies that Japan doesn't employ. Types of subsidies Japan doesn't employ as compared to the types that Japan does employ that lead to overfishing. The reason we know that is because from our sources in Japan, the fishing industry has not gone on the warpath against the TPP, and they would if there were meaningful disciplines. But we do not know what all is in there and how enforceable it is. The kinds of things that those wildlife groups were pushing for were species specific. So they were looking for like a provision that would be specifically about, the TPP forbids trade in shark fins, which is a valuable thing, except the problem is if you have that kind of language in the environmental chapter, and then you have investor state basically saying that you can and cannot do certain things, and if certain companies end up at a loss, you can challenge the government. You can make the government responsible for not doing X, Y, or Z, and then they're also responsible for paying a company for the fact that the company can't do X, Y, or Z because the country can't do X, Y, or Z. And then you set up this conflict of law situation where you end up, apparently, like just for instance, Peru has just gotten backed out of some of its wildlife obligations under the bilateral agreement and some of its endangered forestry obligations. It got backed out of it, and one of its arguments was, we're going to get investor state attacked for doing the things that we're supposed to do in this chapter. The forestry industry is going to be out to get us. And the same kind of dynamic that they used, who knows if that's a legitimate argument or they just weaseled their way out of that language, but either way, they got a rollback, and, allegedly, and that's on pretty good authority, and the same kind of thing could happen. But we'll know more when we actually see the language. But I do think that, World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy already have been wangled into saying vaguely positive things about these conservation measures. No one knows if they've even seen them or they've just been fed a line and they're basically repeating what they were told. We do know that so far Humane Society hasn't said anything, which is interesting, because they would typically be the first ones to say something is good when it's bad, and they haven't yet.
Thanks so much, Lori. Andrea, I'm going to ask you if you could advance to Adam's slide so that we can, we're already a little bit behind even with his schedule, but since Harriet Haywood and Deborah Dion can't be with us tonight, we'll just let Adam share what he plans to share with us tonight and then move on to Mackenzie Wilkins with Flush the TPP. So Adam Weissman with Trade Justice, you have the floor.
Okay, well, hi everyone. So pretty much all the resources I'm going to reference tonight you can find by going to tradejustice.net/1011. It sounds like binary code, but it's just today's date. That's tradejustice.net/1011. So to get started, for those of us in New York State, anywhere in New York State, New York State Senator Hamilton is currently circulating a sign-on letter to New York State senators in both parties, asking them to sign, which would be a letter that would go to members of Congress asking them to oppose TPP. If you would like to work on getting your senator on this letter, the key contact person on this is Eric Weltman at Food and Water Watch. You can download the letter from that link. Moving on to Miami, and so I'll skip right into Deborah's report. So Deborah Dion from Florida Citizens Trade Campaign asked that I present this report, so this is verbatim from Deborah. On October 8th, we unanimously passed a resolution opposing secrecy in trade deals in the City of Miami Commission, host city for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, trade talks taking place from October 19th to 23rd at the Hyatt Regency downtown Miami. The City of Miami is the second largest city in Florida and sets the tone for a week of activities. We will have a media war room at the Courtyard Marriott next door to the Hyatt, October 19th at 9:30 a.m. Opening press conference to set the tone for the week with members of Congress, local elected officials that will talk about huge job loss in the city of Miami and Hialeah as a result of the Caribbean Basin Initiative in the 80s and NAFTA in the 90s. We will also have interfaith, environmental, labor, senior, and food safety reps making presentations. On Wednesday, October 21st, the negotiators will hold a stakeholders meeting, and we will have about 10 national leaders coming from AFL-CIO, international unions, Global Trade Watch, Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, and others. Folks can speak for 6 minutes. We are getting local speakers, and we will pack the room from 11 a.m. to 2:30 p.m., and during the 3:15 to 4:30 p.m. Q&A with chief negotiators. At 10 a.m., we will do a press event at the Courtyard Marriott with our group before we get into the Hyatt for the meeting. And this is me, Adam, speaking here for a second. If that's something you're interested in, the deadline hasn't passed. It's important to register before the deadline for the stakeholders meeting, because after the deadline, they are ruthless about not letting anyone sign up late. Now back to Deborah. Thursday, October 22nd, we will hold a meeting briefing with law professors from University of Miami, Florida International University, and Nova Southeastern University talking about Malaysia, sovereignty issues, prescription drugs, food safety, the environment, and job loss. We will be planning other rapid response activities to respond throughout the week. Folks have to register to attend. Okay, well, she did that. Folks have to register to attend the October 21st meetings, and I can send them the link. My information is dion.deborah@gmail.com or 305-213-3165. People need to register by Wednesday, October 14th. And just to be clear, that's register with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So then she just says, thank you, Deborah. So that's her report. And then also on that page, you can download the actual resolution. And next thing is Trade Justice New York Metro is issuing a statement on the TPP deal. You can also find that statement there. It's 5 pages of quotes from different New York organizations on why, from diverse social movements, about why our particular sector in concern is adversely affected by TPP. Everything from food justice groups to anti-prison groups to environmental groups to international solidarity groups. So this is a great resource in terms of information, but also in terms of finding ideas for groups in your area who you might be able to reach out to build your own local coalitions against TPP. Here in New York this past weekend, or in the New York area, we had the New York Comic-Con, which is a 151,000 usually person convention of fans of comic books and other pop culture. Well, this is a great opportunity for us to talk about how one of the major concerns in Japan about TPP is that TPP could be used to shut down things like cosplay, people dressing up in character costumes, and fan fiction, and fan art, and fan films. So we put together a page of resources, and we've been tweeting all weekend using the New York Comic-Con hashtag with articles from very concerned comic book geeks and about how TPP could affect their hobby. So if you want to find out more about that issue, to reach out at local comic and pop culture conventions near you, there's a link with more information, including a printable flyer. October 14th is a National Day of Climate Actions. This is sort of the same organizers who did the big climate march in New York City last year are now doing a day of action throughout the country. So you can find out, again, this is all at one page, tradejustice.net/1011, about the local actions near you. And then there's a downloadable flyer that you can print to distribute, 4 to a page, as well as a 2 to a page that you can cut form letter that you can use with clipboards to get people to sign and then mail to us to deliver to your local Congress members, or you can just deliver them yourselves. Mackenzie will be talking soon about the October 16th and 17th food justice events. Just one note on that. We've also put on that page a flyer about Monsanto and how they will benefit from TPP that you can download and print for that march. But Mackenzie is the overall contact if you'd like to join a TPP contingent at the food justice event in D.C. on the 16th and 17th. Skipping ahead to some of the upcoming events, like I said, those are upcoming events. This Tuesday is our weekly Twitter storm, where we take to Twitter for 1 hour, 9 o'clock Eastern, to hashtag about TPP and post tweets directed at various politicians and media makers focusing on different issues on a weekly basis. And at this link, you can follow the upcoming events link to be taken to the Twitter storm link to find the latest tweets. This Wednesday, Mackenzie will be telling us about the Popular Resistance Call, and that's also the day of the climate actions. You can find it at the upcoming events page about the local action in New York City, but on the main page you can find out about actions everywhere in the country. Thursday, October 15th, Dr. Robin Falco's weekly Event Horizon show hosts a weekly segment for 1 to 2 hours on trade policy, which I co-host. Still haven't announced this week's guest, but check the upcoming events page for added details. 16th and 17th is the Food Justice March. And then finally, Sunday the 18th, our next national call, Deborah Dion, whose report I read earlier and was not able to be with us this weekend, will be joining us that week to talk not only about the upcoming TTIP protests in Miami, but also to give us some historical context about the last major free trade protest in Miami, the protests against the free trade area of the Americas in 2003, which were an important part in leading to the ultimate collapse of the free trade area of the Americas, the FTA talks, and which hopefully we can have the same effect on TTIP. So that's some of the upcoming events. Happy to take any questions at the appropriate time. So thanks for your time, everyone. And again, one more time, that link is tradejustice.net/1011, and you can find everything that I've talked about there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Adam. And I just typed your link again into the chat box for those in the online meeting room. Anyone who has a question for Adam, please press *6 on your phone. I see we have a hand up. I'm not sure if this is from before, so I'm going to go ahead and call on this person. It's area code 303. It looks like maybe a VoIP number. So 303-325.
Can you hear me?
314. Yes.
Hello?
Okay. Could you let us know who you are, where you are, and your question?
I'm April in Colorado, Englewood, Colorado, and I'm working to get a free zone in Englewood. And I'm just kind of curious, is there one thing that, like, my neighbors can do? Like, should they call Congress? Like, is there a list that's very easy for someone to access for here and for other states? So that's all.
April, I'm going to take a look because I think Nancy Price was on the call. And okay. Nancy, if you are still on the call, could you press *6 on your phone and I'll unmute you so you can answer April's questions? Nancy Price is with Alliance for Democracy, and they are the folks that work on the TPP free zones. So Nancy, are you with us? And if so, could you press *6 so I can unmute you? I don't know if she's still with us. I know she was on the call a little bit earlier today. If not, we can put you in touch with her, April. Are you in the online meeting room as well?
Yeah, I'm in touch with her, so I'll just email her.
Okay. That'd be your best bet. Yes, Nancy can hook you up with the appropriate actions. All right. If anyone has a question for, I think Zahara was still with us. I saw her in the call console. Zahara, are you still with us? I'm not sure if she is or not. Adam is still with us, I know. Does anyone have any other questions for Adam about all of those actions? I'm going to ask him to share all of those links with us, and we'll try and share them after the call. Okay, someone at 347-559-6936 has a hand up. Could you identify us and let us know who you are, where you are, and your question?
Sure. My name's Owen Crowley. I'm actually in New York City. I sort of am acquainted with Adam, who's been speaking. And I'm thinking about what someone said before about a massive turnout in Germany about this issue. And I wonder if anyone who's been speaking can give us, an elevator pitch or just a quick one-liner that we can pass along in terms of a mass distribution of what people can do, a regular person as opposed to a trade wonk, to engage on this issue.
Good question. Adam, do you want to take that, or do we want to let Lori, if she's still with us, or Mackenzie weigh in on that?
I mean, I would just say, and I'd be happy to let either of them say far more than I could, but I think the key, if there's one action people can take, it's contacting their members of Congress. If that's the one thing people are going to do, make that call to your representative and your senators and let them know that November, particularly for our reps, November 2016 is coming up soon. And we will treat anything, if a TPP vote hasn't happened by then, we'll treat anything but an outright commitment to vote against it as a commitment to vote yes for TPP when we go to the ballot boxes. And for any for our senators who are up for election this year, same thing. For senators who are not up for election in 2016, let them know that we have long memories.
Thanks so much, Adam. And now we'd like to introduce Mackenzie McDonald-Wilkins with Flush the TPP and Popular Resistance. Mackenzie, you are up. Andrea's going to move the slide for you, and there you go. You have the mic, sir.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for all of this. Is really amazing to be on this call and just to kind of hear from all of the people doing amazing work across the country every time I'm on the call. So thank you, everyone from PDA. Thanks, Lori, Adam, and thanks, April, too, for getting on. And I've been in touch with April as well about the TPP free zone in Englewood, and that's very exciting. So keep up the good work. So I think pretty much I just wanted to go over a few more of the upcoming events that Adam kind of started to talk about. So basically, now that a TPP deal has been reached, we really do have a lot of work to do to continue to educate, to organize, and mobilize to make TPP politically toxic, and ultimately break this deal while we continue to build our movement and power against the entire corporate trade agenda that includes also these other deals like the TTIP and also the Trade and Services Agreement, which is the largest of these three. So I think we do have a little bit of momentum right now, especially with a lot of the really amazing actions coming out of Atlanta. So thanks to everyone who's down in Atlanta And thanks to Hara. So one thing, we've been organizing weekly phone calls as well. So those are Wednesday night phone calls every Wednesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Pacific. You can find out more at flushthetpp.org/news. You can kind of get the link and stuff to the calls. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what's happening kind of right now. With a focal point in Europe, we are in the middle of an international week of action, which is from October 10th through the 17th. The website for the week of action is tradeforpeople.org, and that's with the number 4, so it's tradeforpeople.org. If you go to the website, you can see a really very impressive action map with actions around the world, but really focused in Europe right now. We've been working with a lot of these people who are the organizers for the Trade for People Week of Action in Europe at the European TTIP Coalition. A lot of really amazing organizers and groups, and clearly there's something a little bit different happening in Europe than in the United States in terms of the amount of public awareness and outrage about the TTIP. And the level of organizing there is very impressive, and I think we have a lot to learn from what they're doing. So as Lori mentioned, there were 250,000 out in Berlin yesterday to kick off this week of actions. There were also over 130 other events across Europe yesterday, and a lot more to come for the rest of this week. So if you go to the Trade for People on Twitter, like hashtag Trade for People, or on the Facebook or the website, you can kind of start to get a little sense of some of the stuff, and just look up actions in TTIP around Europe, and you can kind of find some of the stuff that's happening. There's lots of amazing actions happening, mostly in Western European countries, but there are also actions in Nepal that are being planned, which is pretty exciting, and there are actions in Thailand against the TPP. And we have a handful of actions in the United States. Adam mentioned one thing that some folks are getting involved with, which is the People's Climate Movement actions, which are happening this coming Wednesday across the country. And in Washington, D.C., for instance, we're organizing sort of no climate justice without trade justice, just to sort of highlight how how basically TPP, TTIP, and TISA are binding international law, whereas anything that comes out of the UN Climate Summit really isn't binding international law and would be severely undermined, in fact, by the TPP, TTIP, and TISA. So it's pretty problematic that the same countries that will be going to the United Nations to try to reach some sort of climate agreement are also simultaneously engaging in TPP, TTIP, and TISA negotiations, which are extremely threatening to the climate and to anything that really comes out of the UN anyway. Not to mention the Sustainable Development Goals and lots of other stuff that the United Nations is doing. So you can find actions on that map. There are actions in the Northeast, there are actions in D.C., there are actions in the West Coast in the United States. So it's kind of good to see that we got some stuff going on in the United States as well during this week of action. And a lot of this will be leading up to a national convergence in Washington, D.C. this November 14th through 18th. I don't know if we'll be able to get 250,000 people there, but that would be awesome if we could.
For Mackenzie, we need to move the slide.
Sorry?
Because we need to move the slide for you to your next page. There you go.
Cool.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so right after this week of actions, Adam mentioned the TTIP negotiations happening in Miami, and then there's a lot of momentum, and we're building up towards a big series of actions in Washington, D.C., sort of national mobilization in Washington, D.C. against the TPP, TTIP, and TISA, and obviously this is a really strategic time, especially with the TPP deal just finalized, a really important moment to mobilize our base and to come together for a big convergence in Washington, D.C. and get some awesome actions going on and continue our movement building in person there together. So definitely invite everyone to come join. It's going to be very fun. There's a lot of stuff going on. people are organizing buses and carpools to come, or just kind of coming by themselves, or with trying to bring a friend or two. The first 2 days, on Saturday and Sunday, will be in basically sort of an action camp. We'll be doing art builds and anti-oppression work and direct action training and strategy trainings and discussion and all kinds of stuff. And then Monday through Wednesday will be days of action, so there are lots of ideas that we've been talking about for action and stuff at the USTR, international solidarity actions, at the TPP country embassies perhaps, including something at the Philippine embassy, where at the same time as our actions, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation will be having meetings in the Philippines to continue to push the TPP in the Asia-Pacific region in particular, and also where the United States is trying to push the Philippines to change its constitution to allow foreign ownership of land so that the Philippines could also enter into the TPP. And our allies in the Philippines, Bayan and the Peasants Movement and others, are organizing mass protests. And their solidarity groups like Bayan in the United States are part of organizing for the November actions as well here in Washington, D.C. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on then. And one other thing actually that I forgot to mention, this coming week in Washington, D.C., and you can do solidarity actions as well, is the Food Justice March. And this is basically, it's the first time that March Against Monsanto is doing their national action, really focusing on one location and trying to get as many people to DC as possible. So it looks like a really awesome action. On the 16th, we're going to have it basically, the 16th, which is this Friday, is Global Food Day. And we'll be gathering in front of the White House at Lafayette Park around 3 p.m. For a narrative march. And we're doing more than a TPP contingent. The TPP is really central, actually, to food justice around the world. To farmers' rights and to food justice and so on. And so we're going to be, actually our first stop is at the Chamber of Commerce and at the United States Trade Rep. This will be the first action actually at the USTR since the TPP deal was finalized. So this is really a pretty important moment. This Friday coming on the 16th. So, and then there's also a rally on Saturday, and so that'll be another fun period sort of leading up to the November 14th through 18th mobilization in DC. You can find all this information on fleshthetpp.org. I know there are lots of websites, which is amazing to see so many people working on this in a more and more coordinated fashion all the time. So I guess that's pretty much the main stuff I wanted to talk about. I'm always available to communicate. If anyone has questions about the TPP or these other deals or organizing or actions or whatever, feel free to contact me at mackenzie@popularresistance.org. And you can learn more about all of the stuff that we worked on at Flush the TPP and at popularresistance.org.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Are you in the online meeting room as well?
No, I'm not.
No, you're not. Okay, so I'm going to ask maybe Adam or one of our chat hosts to please type that email address of yours. It was Mackenzie@flushthetpp.org, is that correct?
Mackenzie@popularresistance.org.
Okay, Mackenzie@popularresistance.org, and it's MACKENZIE, if I remember correctly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Andrea. All right, so I would just like to take a moment to thank, I know Zahara came back on the call, and I wanted to thank her so much for sharing so much of her own experience and all of the wonderful things that she did in Atlanta, and I know it was incredibly inspiring for all of us. I'd like to thank Lori Wallach for joining us tonight, and all of the activists have been working so hard to keep this alive. I know it's very easy to be discouraged, but this family has been working so hard on this, and I really feel we are a family. So thank you so much for all of your work, and as noted, we will be on the call again next Sunday, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about what's happening, and we just thank you so much for your work and ask you to stay with us. We're close to the finish line, and we just need to stay the course through this final vote on TPP and make sure that we make them aware that to vote on TPP or promote it in any way is going to carry a political price. Thank you so much, everyone, and we will see you next week.